Design Lab within the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape. My name is John Brown and I'm the Dean of the school. And I want to begin by having us pause for a moment and just think about where we are and why we are here in the fall with the bountiful harvests that we are enjoying with fruit and vegetables. It makes us think of the land, and from there, I think by a natural extension, the indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land for millennia, and the debt that we owe them for the way in which they cared for the natural environment. And I think we can take pause to consider what we as settler culture have done to that environment over the course of several hundred years. And as we gather tonight to talk about the plans for the downtown east, I think it's also important for us to recognize the role that architects, planners, and landscape architects have played in the social injustices of the past and the present. Not individually, well, sometimes individually, but not really individually. This isn't an individual thing. This is about the structures, the power structures that we create and that we participate in that actually maintain and sustain the systemic racism that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as Black Lives Matters and the whole notion of social equity for the broader community across many different dimensions is settled. With all that said, I just also want to remark that when we meet in this place, which is it's important for a couple of reasons. One, that used to be, many of you will remember, this was the Central Public Library before we got the fancy one from Snowetta, which is a beautiful building. But like the Snowetta building, this library was open to everyone. And when we had the traditional smudge ceremony that opened this with our school elders, they talked about how the energy in this place was good because it was something that welcomed all. And sometimes it was welcoming just to get more, or just to go to the washroom, or just to get access to internet, that sort of thing. And so I think that this, as when we founded the City Building Design Lab, we founded it on that principle, that this space in particular is open to anyone that wants to meet, to talk about cities, to talk about climate action, social justice, the notion of vibrancy, and well-being. And so part of that is that I think is the power of this place is that it really is only a couple of hundred meters away from the place where the Elbow and the Bow River cross, which was the traditional.
I didn't understand that.
Which was the tradition. That's great. Which was the traditional meeting place for the indigenous people. So to be formal about it, I just want to recognize the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Dakota First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation, who were the signatories of the Treaty 7 that happened in 1877, and also that the city of Calgary is home to Métis Nation Region 3. So welcome to this place, and thank you for all of the hard work that the team has been doing over the last couple of days to make this, to re-envision what Downtown West might be. I want to thank our sponsors, the Calgary Downtown Association, the City of Calgary, the Center for Civilization, which is Alberto's lab, the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape, which is us, and in particular Stantec, the professional firm that has been at the core of making all of this happen. It's, I think, a great start to something. It's time that we took hold of the city and decided how do we make a city that everybody wants to live in rather than one that just performs the expediency of creating a place to work and a place to live for all the people who used to be coming here because of the oil and gas industry. So I think it's a wonderful thing to be thinking about this, and I'm very interested to hear what all of you have to say in the panel. And on that note, I will pass you over to Dr. Alberto de Salvatierra, an assistant professor in the architecture program in our school.
Hello everyone, good evening. Thank you again for joining us today. It is my pleasure to introduce our three panelists for this evening. I'll be also moderating this session. So again, I'm Professor Alberto de Salvatierra, Director of the Center for Civilization and Assistant Professor of Urbanism and Data and Architecture here at Stantec. It's been my pleasure to welcome you all here today, particularly because tomorrow we'll be taking down the exhibition that you see there in the gallery. So I want to give a shout out to all the graduate research assistants that have made that possible, and to all the prospective applicants that have been participating in this event to sort of secure their position in the lab, given that we're now hiring and expanding on our work. So I'll be introducing the panelists, and sort of in like MBA fashion, we'll be coming out one at a time. So if we could hold the applause until the very end, until I finish reading the little kind of bios, and then they can sort of come out. So first we have Mary Rowe, is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Urban Institute. She's a leading urban advocate and civil society trailblazer who has worked in cities and with communities across Canada and the United States. Mary was president of the Canadian platform Ideas That Matter, a convening and publishing program based on the work of renowned urbanist Jane Jacobs, when a mid-career fellowship with the US-based Blue Moon Fund led her to New Orleans. There she worked with national philanthropy, governments, and community activists to support rebuilding through micro-investments in neighborhood projects for 7 years in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Prior to joining CUI, Mary lived in New York City and served as Executive Vice President of the Municipal Art Society, one of America's oldest civic advocacy organizations focused on the built environment. Help me welcoming Mary Rowe. So next up we have Brett Roller, who is a downtown advocate and urban planner working in Memphis, Tennessee. As Vice President of Planning and Development at the Downtown Memphis Commission, Brett administers the DMC's portfolio of economic development tools and incentive programs, including development programs, facade grants, and commercial property tax freeze program. Brett also leads Open on Main, a pop-up retail program that has filled 7 vacant commercial spaces on Main Street and provided over 50 local entrepreneurs a low-risk opportunity to open a downtown business. He also manages DMC's anti-blight team to proactively address the top 25 vacant and blighted properties downtown. Please help me in welcoming Brett Roller. And finally, certainly not least, we have David Dixon, Vice President and Urban Places Fellow at Stantec. Residential Architecture magazine named David to their Hall of Fame as the person we can call to ask about cities. In recent years, he's led planning in post-Katrina New Orleans, transformed strip malls into new suburban downtowns, and initiated a broad reappraisal of the role of density in building more livable, resilient, and equitable communities. A sought-after expert in urban planning and design, David is well known for helping create new mixed-use urban districts in both cities and suburbs, and the planning, rehabilitation, and redevelopment of downtowns. His current and recent work focuses on urban transformations, including the reemergence of the long-depressed East Rampington neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, as an arts innovation district, creation of a master plan for the 9 million square foot mixed-use Water Street district adjacent to downtown Tampa, and a market-driven redevelopment of a public housing site in Charleston, a 3,200 unit mixed-income neighborhood with no displacement in one of Boston's most historic neighborhoods. A fellow of the AIA, David was honored with the Thomas Jefferson Medal for a lifetime of creating livable neighborhoods, vibrant civic spaces, and vital downtowns. Please join me in welcoming David Dixon.
Tell your marketing people to send shorter bios.
Does this work? Yes. So the way this is going to go, we have 4 questions, so about an hour, so perhaps 3 or 4 minutes per question per person. So I'll begin, and then we can sort of begin the conversation. So over the past 2 days, we have been discussing, debating, and ideating on the future of downtowns, the future of Calgary, and the future of downtown West End. So to open our conversation this evening, I wanted to zoom out in scale and momentarily reframe our operating context. So does this sound good with everyone? Yes? So less than 24 hours ago, the World Wildlife Federation and the Zoological Society of London, 2 of the foremost authorities in their fields, released the authoritative report on its subject matter, titled the Living Planet Index, that revealed wildlife populations worldwide have cratered 70% since 1970. This comes in the heels of historic flooding in Pakistan, record-setting drought in China, powerful hurricanes ravaging the United States, massive and persistent heat waves across the Indian subcontinent and Europe, where in the UK, temperatures not expected until 2050 were reached 28 years ahead of schedule. We've been calling this climate change. Perhaps we ought to change our everyday syntax to climate crisis. So within the context of the planet's rapidly accelerating climate crisis, climate emergency, climate breakdown, how can cities and the people working to advance the built environment in those cities more appropriately embody and operate within the severe urgency that this inflection point presents for civilization? And to be clear, I'm not asking how do we better implement climate action strategies. Through the work of the Downtown Design Study we had the pleasure to attend, we've heard already from Professor Joshua Terran, Associate Lead Researcher here at Southall, and Grace Coulter-Sherlock, Principal of Rowe, around public policy efforts across Canada in that space. What I'm asking is, how do we better work and communicate this overall urgency, this ticking time bomb, that we will soon render vast swaths of Earth unlivable? How do we integrate this knowledge into our work and plan efforts for communities like Downtown West? I'd also like to foreground this question in the local context. On November 15, 2021, so almost exactly 1 year ago, Calgary City Council declared a climate emergency. A declaration of climate emergency, for those unfamiliar, is a resolution passed by a governing body such as the City Council. It puts the local government on record in support of emergency action to respond to climate change and recognize the pace and scale of action needed. So how can we best take advantage of both global and local urgency? How can we do better at communicating this urgency to act, to improve and safeguard our cities to the general public? How do we better embody this urgency within our work?
I was going to say age before beauty.
He's the kid. I'm the beautiful one.
I know, beautiful and gorgeous.
Yeah. So I have no idea how to answer that, but I'm going to give it a try. So first of all, who was involved in creating those models out there? Anyone in the room? No students? No. I was going to tell you how much I love them. I think they're beautiful. So there's that. So my name's Brett. I work at the Downtown Memphis Commission. That's a long way away in Memphis, Tennessee. But I will say that question struck me. How do we communicate a sense of urgency? I don't think we're doing a good job at all with it, at least in my climate, my environment, my economy. So rewinding just a little bit. Can y'all hear me okay? All right, I'm giant and I'm soft-spoken, so it's a weird combination, I know. So my job is to get developers to build things in downtown Memphis, to build tall buildings, to renovate buildings, to bring people an opportunity in downtown Memphis. So most of the time, our crisis is an economic one. We're having to bend over backwards to plug gaps, fill capital stacks on projects, and get banks to do things they don't want to do. So I will be the first to admit that climate action is not something we normally talk about. And try not to boo me when I say this, okay? Try not to boo me. Hopefully you won't throw anything. But we're updating our design guidelines. So when someone gets a public incentive, they have to meet what we think of as high standards for design. And we had a meeting a few weeks back, maybe a month back, talking about do we put in some of these sustainability strategies in those design guidelines? And myself and others said, no, that's not the focus of this work. Boo. So something changed my mind. A few weeks later, I'm going to butcher the gentleman's name. I think his name is Brent Tondarian. There you go. So did anybody else see it? You probably did a few weeks ago. So he gave this speech at IDA, at the International Downtown Association in Vancouver, and he linked climate change to real-world problems that face us every day. In Memphis, our original settlers, the Chickasaw Nation, were smart enough to build on the top of the bluff. So we're right against the Mississippi River. It probably will never be high enough to impact our downtown. So it's easy for us to sit in Memphis, Tennessee and think, yeah, I hope all the bees don't die, but you know what, the river's not going to get this high, it's not going to flood downtown Memphis. Maybe climate change isn't a concern for us. But Brent connected a few dots. He talked about the drought in Syria and the humanitarian crisis, civil war, how that led to a refugee crisis, and how that was one of the deciding issues for Brexit. I never would have thought that climate change could have led to something like that. So it really opened my mind. I'm very proud to say this is where you can cheer instead of booing. I'm proud to say I went back to our consultants, I went back to my team and said, let's add in some sustainability work here. Let's make it a focus of our design guidelines. So, yay! So, I don't know how to communicate the sense of urgency other than we have to connect those dots in a local way. We have to tell stories better about how this actually matters to you. If I were to walk around the streets of my city and ask people, do you care about climate change? I think very few would understand how it relates to their daily life, how it impacts their daily life. And I think that's up to us as people building built environments and creating neighborhoods and helping strengthen downtowns to realize that we have to tell better stories and we have to make it obvious why it should matter to people.
Either way. Okay. Oh, here. Oh, sorry. Okay. Can you hear me? Is this might be on? Is that? Yes, now it's on. Anyway, hello. Thank you for all being here and listening to him. Booing and cheering. Thank you. I'm David Dixon. I'm an urban designer, and I am going to take a step back in life. When I was an undergraduate in college, I was in a program called the College of Social Studies, which was about history, government, and economics, and it was highly interdisciplinary. And it was all about teaching us not to approach a problem from a single perspective, but to try and find as many relevant perspectives as we could and bring them together. So, and now don't boo me. Boo him. Okay, so I think one challenge that the climate change or climate crisis movement has is it is viewed by many as a single issue movement. Obviously, from what Brett just said, it isn't. But I think it is important, we all need to find ways to link this to other issues that are fundamental to people's lives. And I'm going to now make a jump for a second and talk about an organization I'm involved in. It's called America Walks, and it was founded by it was founded by leaders of the walking movement. There's a movement, okay. And I was asked to join, and I think walkability is really important because it creates real estate value, it unlocks economic development opportunity, it promotes community. I like walking, but you know, I'm not a movement guy, so dude has that, a movement guy. And so I've been trying really hard to get my fellow board members to realize all the other powerful arguments we have. For example, and then I'm going to come back for a second, present trends extended. The federal government in the US, that's that other country, I'm trying to pretend I'm Canadian, but I can't. 100% that by 2050 of the discretionary federal budget will go to pay for health care. That means no dollars for affordable housing, no dollars for transportation. Okay, so we obviously can't sustain that, but it's a very important, it's a twin crisis, and we need to start linking these in people's minds. So, what I want to present is, to me, the most important thing that people like we can do, besides the larger conversation that you talked about, and, you know, bringing the awareness of how real this is and not just real, how impactful, is to link this to other issues. So, Mary, I got to know Mary when I was doing planning in New Orleans following Katrina, and she was one of the wonderful people who showed up to really make a difference. And one of the things that really struck me, there were a number of folks from the Netherlands who came over. And they talked about what the Dutch had learned following World War II. When their infrastructure was destroyed, the North Sea was very threatening, and they discovered that it was really hard to get people excited about spending a lot of money on dikes, even though we think that's fundamentally Dutch. But if you could turn protection from resilience into quality of life, so you don't just build a barrier, you turn that barrier into beaches. You don't just build a wall, you build a financial center and use it as a wall. In other words, you do things that enhance livability, economic opportunity. So they said a guilder spent on resilience or protection needs to be a guilder spent on quality of life and economic opportunity. That made a difference. So let's fast forward here. If you look at what's happening to this country broadly and the changes going on, there are a number of changes that are really supportive of a climate resiliency agenda. And people are having a hard time with these, and if we link them all, I think everything's going to make progress. So, over the next 20 years, 80+% of all net new households, that's the housing market, are going to be singles and couples. This is the most urban generation we will have ever had. This is the strongest downtown urban neighborhood, think grow up, not out, for our regions we will have had. It turns out that the per capita emissions impact or footprint of somebody who lives in the suburbs and depends on a car is 3 to 4 times their peers, same economy, same level of education, et cetera, if they live in the city and can walk. Well, I don't think there's anything that we can do that cities can do that will be more impactful than unlocking the ability to reverse generations of sprawl and really bring people downtown. It turns out that 1,000 new housing units within a 5-minute walk will bring a block of Main Street to life. So in fact, the density that is required to grow up, not out, is what brings our streets to life, fosters community. It also turns out, it's good that you're all going to school, I think many of you, some of us already did, that 90+% of net new jobs for the next 20 years are going to require higher education. That means educated workforce. It turns out that folks with more education also like urban life, lively streets, community more than other peers. So what is good for the environment is what will respond to a housing, and a housing market is 2/3 of our real estate economy, is what we also need to do to create economic opportunity for our cities and regions. And to put just one more exclamation point on this, it was very interesting to see that interesting, it's tragic to see that 70% of species of wildlife have disappeared since 1970. Something else has happened since 1970 that's also a 70% figure. Did you know that the average household in North America's real income is 70% of what it was in 1970? In other words, because we're not paying enough attention to growing our cities in, not out, to growing economic opportunity, to understanding our demographic shifts, we're all paying a major price. Our regions are less competitive. Our gross national product is lower in both Canada and the US because we're not doing the things we need to grow our economy, which are also the things we need to do to be more climate responsible. And before I go on and on and on, I'm going to hand this, or no, I don't have, to my New Orleans colleague, and Mary.
Thank you. You just never want to meet this guy in a dark alley. Look at that arm and those accoutrements.
Is it because his questions are so hard?
I know.
Is that why?
That's it. I was just, if I don't answer it right, that's what I get. I am going to come at this quite differently. I think the problem, the challenge we've had, and I'm old, so I am not quite as old as David, but getting there, is that I've heard this same mantra for 35 or 40 years. And I think for many of us, it's been overwhelming, or we just haven't been able to wrap our heads around what the implications were. And there were people who were advocates, who were zealots about this, and were saying the sky is falling, the sky is falling. And I feel like the dilemma that we have as communicators is you can scare people into a place of complete immobilization where they don't feel like they have any choice at all, and they basically say screw it, you know. And we can see that in our politics in Canada. We've got a whole constituency that are basically saying screw it, and I worry about this because I appreciate that there is urgency, and the difference between now and when I was a kid, and there were people who were saying, is that now you actually do have examples of it on your doorstep. You've had too many hot days, you've had too many sudden rain events, you're seeing repeated reports of droughts, and so you can actually viscerally see it. You can see the prices of your food going up. So I want to draw another 1970s example. In 1975, how many of you were not born in 1975? How many were born after 1975? Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, thanks. Okay. So, boys and girls, I'm going to tell you a story about the past. In 1975, I got my driver's license. And my dad had a big honkin' Polara, Dodge Polara, with a bench seat. That's how I learned to drive. And I loved that thing. I drove it to school when I could get the car. And it was a big, comfortable thing. There were not bucket seats back then. And about half a year into me having the wheels, seatbelts became mandatory. And I was furious. I liked that big loungy feel in the seat. And we had to belt up. Now those of you can't believe this, right? But prior to that, you just put your arm on the top of the seat and you bombed along. You think, we're just seatbelt. Seatbelts came in because there was enough data and enough persuasion to the auto companies that they had to make them mandatory because they were killing too many people on roads. And the healthcare costs associated with car accidents were significant enough that all of a sudden you had to put your seatbelt on, right? And now, none of us probably think much about this unless we're in Texas. We put our seatbelt on, right? You wouldn't think of driving without your seatbelt. Very rarely. If you're up in the country, you might say, oh, well, no. But generally you put that seatbelt on. So I use that as an example of, ultimately, to do the right thing, it took a law. And then the law eventually became regular. It became something that we all do, but it took a law. And I think that had I just been, if you'd been inundated with materials saying, it's very dangerous to not wear your seatbelt, you might kill yourself, you might kill someone else. In the same way that we've had the same fight for years about driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Eventually they're gonna move to a place where if you're impaired, your car won't turn on. We haven't gotten quite there, but we will, I bet you. And that's I think that's to me part of the antidote to helplessness, is that if a carbon tax is applied to us, then we don't have to navigate and spend all that cognitive space deciding, oh, should I make that purchase, should I not make that purchase? All of a sudden the purchase is too expensive, and so you don't make it because the carbon tax has made it too expensive. So I think we have to get realistic about the relative limited impact that scaremongering has. And think instead about how do you affect policy making and industrial design decisions, and the kinds of decisions you were just mentioning exactly, that decisions you can make and that your clients can make, that will make my life and my behavior conform in a way that will be better for the climate. So I think we have to be always trying to put both of those things in our heads. The second thing I would say is I always feel when a problem is too big, we've just got to find a way to make it smaller. And I feel like that political demeanor that we're struggling with, they're struggling with it more in the US, but it is here, as we know. In fact, you guys really know it as of 2 days ago, and you're seeing it coming out swinging. I think we've got to very smartly get to the household, individual, family, unit, individual level, and help people find ways to exercise some of their own choices in ways that feel more responsible to them and feel that they're having an impact. Because if people feel chronically helpless or hopeless or both, or disenfranchised or judged, then it immobilizes them. So I think it's got to be a mixture of some rules, some tough rules, some laws, and then some kind of what all of us over the last 2 days have spent time doing. How do you actually have impact at the local level so that people can make a contribution to addressing something that's so much bigger than they are? At the climate level, they walk more, whatever the particular steps are that we can encourage people to take. And there are people in this room with skills, and you saw it all on the walls here, who can actually set up situations for all of us to make it much easier for me to do the right thing rather than the wrong thing.
Let's give a round of applause for our first event.
We can clap for us and boo for him.
So Mary, thank you, Mary, Brett, David, for your responses. And Mary, yours in particular, I think is a perfect segue.
How about that?
Into my next question. Because, in my first question, I purposely used heavy and aggressive, though in my opinion necessary, vocabulary to reframe our current operating context. So my follow-up question to all of you would be, what other adjustments in language, what other reframing of conversations do you think we should be enacting to better facilitate our work, right? Can this sort of be a catalyst to further combat NIMBYism? Can we break through municipal policy gridlock? Can we rise past 4-year cycles of political will? Are there any other adjustments to how we talk about these issues that can result in more effective collaborations or more urgent actions? And you know, the point about the laws is very well taken, but I think in advance of those laws, there also has to be sort of a collective discourse that is sort of informed and influenced by the language that we use to describe these issues. And then we say, oh, you know, in Florida, for example, a number of years ago, the governor at the time, might have been DeSantis, might have been somebody else, outlawed climate change as a word, as a phrase in policy documents. So instead, they had to call it nuisance flooding. So anywhere climate change was mentioned, it was replaced by nuisance flooding. Of course, now that hurricanes have ravaged most of Florida, the governor feels differently. But if we were to, you know, instead of saying climate change this, climate change that, you know, climate breakdown, right? Or instead of saying, you know, our 10, 15-year horizons, like our apocalypse date, right? At some point.
Well, that's cheery.
Well, yeah, not to go too much into fear-mongering, but I think, you know, stepping back into the vocabulary and the ways that we define these things, how can we,
I have a really quick answer.
how can we talk about these issues differently to activate?
So I have a really quick answer.
Go.
I think that the everything local movement is our answer. I think it works on the right and on the left. Buy local, consume local, stay local, you know, experience local, make local, all culture is local. It is by definition addressing climate impacts and supply chains and everything else. And the pandemic gave us a perfect opportunity. At CUI, this institute that I work at, and so does my colleague Robert, we're marking, believe it or not, December 7th is 1,000 days of COVID since the World Health Organization declared it. And so we're marking that and saying, okay, what's the COVID dividend? What are we going to extract from this 1,000-day experience that's going to really change the way we do everything? And I think that people had a visceral reminder that what's within their immediate vicinity is what is really important, where they work, where they buy things, where they hang out with people, where they borrow a book, where they get Wi-Fi, where they get a coffee, where they trade some old clothes for some new clothes, whatever it is, all local. It's such a simple thing. It's not political. It's not draconian. I don't think it's ideological. And to me, it's a very tangible way to come to. It's going to affect our food. It affects every aspect of the way that we live. And when you're in a jurisdiction like this, where you've had extractive industries dominate your economic development for 4, 5, 6, 7 decades, you've got to find some really easy language that is hopeful, and don't even go into those fights with those people. You know, it's too difficult to try to win them. Why would you even try? Like, don't even try. But even the most hard-boiled, right-wing UCP or Republican person is not going to object when you talk about supporting independent businesses, local businesses, and local making and local consuming. I really don't think they will. So that, to me, is it's all local.
That's a great answer. I don't like how you pointed towards me when you said Republican. But so, drowning would be a nuisance. I think I agree with that. So we don't require LEED certification. We don't require net zero, et cetera, you know, in Memphis. But everything that we do, I think, is part of the solution. We're trying to build compact critical mass. We think cities are a big part of the solution. We believe strongly in Memphis, Tennessee, about adaptive reuse. I didn't invent the bumper sticker, but the greenest building is one that's already built. I think we've heard all that before. So I think we're doing a lot in our daily work, but we obviously have to do more. It's hard to have a scientific debate with people that don't value science. I'm going to keep this abstract to protect the non-innocent party in my story. But I had a discussion with a very, very smart person that may or may not be an elected official somewhere on planet Earth. And I was asking about some of these climate change issues. We were talking about the impact. And they said, baby, don't worry, Jesus will take care of us. And I remember thinking, does Jesus have a spaceship? Because that might be what we need. So it's hard to reframe ideas if we're not all looking at data or we're looking at science. But I agree with your premise that at a household level, at a person-to-person level, most people are good. I think most people want to make things better and not worse. And if we talk about this as an ethical choice, I think we have more ability to sway opinions than if we just rely on data. If people want to do the right thing, I'm sure of it. In my work, the development community will want to see a business case. They want to see a business case for why the life cycle of sustainable materials or sustainable buildings or net zero buildings, how that makes sense for their bottom line. We can't give up on that. But at the end of the day, I truly believe that most people, once they're presented with a good argument and they see the impact in their own lives, they see things getting warmer, they see weather getting weirder, storms getting worse. I hope it's not too late.
So I'll be even briefer. It is too late now.
You have a spaceship.
Do I have a spaceship? I have a time machine. All right. This is a serious topic. Okay. So I want to pick up on, I guess, what my colleagues are saying, and I was thinking I'm trying to be even more local than Mary, so I'm going to be. It's not about being local; it's about being personal. How's that? But anyway, I want to talk about an experience working with the community to get past NIMBYism, because I think that's at the core of much of this. And this was planning, should I say this, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, around MIT. And as one of my colleagues pointed out, everybody feels they have a PhD in what you do, which can make for some complex community interactions. I like to say this bruise came from community interaction. We were planning for Kendall Square, which is the heart of life science innovation community. Actually, it's the most important innovation cluster in the U.S. around life science. And an area called Central Square, which is sort of the traditional downtown for Cambridge, Massachusetts. And how should I say it? These folks had a fully inconsistent view of planning. They hated sprawl and they hated density. They loved individualism, and they didn't want anybody to do anything that they didn't like next door. I mean, it just went on and on and on. In order to create a rational plan, which they also really hated gentrification, but because they opposed density, opposed construction of new housing. Well, they lived in a place that a lot of people wanted to live. And Kendall Square pays very, very high salaries to folks because they're hard to lure there. So, Central Square is right next door, great place to live. So basically the average person, I'm sorry, maybe come back to you. So I really believe in facts and in sharing those facts with people so that, how should I say it? I want to feel that when working with a community that they are making informed decisions. Informed decisions about their own self-interest, actually, which does not always happen, by the way. So we really went to work and don't expect change in a month of interaction with the community. It takes time. It takes 6 months or 8 months or 9 months or maybe a year. But to really share with folks, particularly in Central Square, who lived in Kendall Square, they just worked there, what were the larger trends shaping their lives? How could they intervene so that at a local level their lives were better in ways that responded to these trends? So the average person in Central Square moved every 7 years. 1/7 of the housing turned over. That meant that because there were so many more affluent people showing up, this community that hated gentrification was growing 1/7 more affluent every year. I mean, people did not make that connection, but we could literally demonstrate what was happening to household incomes like this because there was not enough housing. And they didn't want to invest in affordable housing because those folks would actually be just like them, think of themselves that way, but because that meant density, et cetera. But when they came to understand that if they didn't find ways to increase it, to find the right place for density along the major Mass Ave is the major street there, to find ways to grow and adjust to the times, that they were all going to gentrify themselves out. Because let me tell you, when the household income rises like this and housing prices like this, so do real estate taxes. Anyway, so long story short, a community leader who had been one of the most, I'm going to try and find, I can't find a polite term, but not progressive, leaders of this community. He'd really fought to protect his community from what he felt were bad things like density, etc. They really wanted to protect the long-term retailers who didn't pay, who could only afford low rents. There was actually an LP, a record store, anyway, they just all loved everything. But they didn't want to do the things that would financially enable a landlord to charge 1/3 the rent they could, because maybe they could add more density. So anyway, so this guy said, you know what? I have fought the good fight up till now, but I now understand that my job is to fight the good fight in today's world. So they actually formed, I forgot what it was called, it was not the anti-NIMBYs, but it was sort of the Cambridge Progress Society or something like that. And he got really serious about understanding the role of density. How much do we need to grow housing? You can actually put a number on it. How much affordable housing do we need to stabilize and make sustainable the kind of income mix we have now? And that meant a lot of new housing, and he turned around and supported and helped his community support it. Worked a lot in a community called Dublin, Ohio, which is one of the most affluent suburbs in the Midwest. Long story short, it was built around golf courses. It's a really cool golf. I don't play golf, so this all left me cold. But they had pulled a lot of the Class A office employment out of Columbus, Ohio to Dublin because, and the only requirement, you could build whatever you wanted as long as the landscaping around it was so cool that nobody could really see all the surface parking. I mean, that was literally the one requirement. So, long story short, they had a city manager who came in and said, this is not the future, life's changing, knowledge industry is coming, we have to attract talent, they don't want to live in 5-bedroom houses on a golf course, etc. So we need to create a new downtown. Well, that meant a sea change in attitudes for the good folks of Dublin, who all had very self-satisfied lives, but came to understand that if Dublin didn't have a walkable center, which required enough density, that 1,000 units with a 5-minute walk to support a block of Main Street, that Dublin was going to fade away in an era where the demand for their houses was declining because the market was, preferring more and more urban housing, this kind of thing. And it got to the point where people were raising their hand in meetings and saying, knowing that this wasn't going to change a blade of grass on their front yard, are we going to get enough density so that we can have the amenity that means we can get on a bike with the family, ride on the bike path, and get ice cream at the new town square? It took time to have these conversations, but they really could be had. I remember actually somebody in New Orleans proposed that there was talk of a transit extension, which transit in New Orleans, or whatever the term for internal contradiction is unfortunately the case. And they said, you know what, let's propose TOD. They stood up at a meeting and said, your neighborhood's going to have transit-oriented development. This is what it looks like. It was all venture, et cetera. And you could imagine how that went. And I remember saying, it's going to take you 6 months, 9 months, or a year to have that conversation, and you'll get to yes. If we're willing to have the patience and really share the information that folks need to make decisions in their own self-interest, it's pretty obvious we're all going to do. One last thing, and then I'll pass the other crisis that we have that we don't talk enough about and is really linked to climate change in that they both share the same solutions, which is walkable density, is health. Folks who live in auto-dependent environments have much poorer health data than folks who live in urban centers. When you correct for income and things like much better. I mean, you can add 10 years to somebody's lifespan by moving them to a much more urban environment. You also save our collective society billions of dollars in the process that we can spend on other things. But people have to understand this. They have to get it. When they do, they make rational decisions. So on this note of what I think is optimism, thank you.
Thank you again, David, Brett, Mary. And this time, David, you gave me a perfect segue into the third question. So, because you're really talking about identifying opportunities that the local community did not really understand at the beginning of this process. So in my third question, we've talked about urgency, we've talked about language, and now let's talk about opportunities. So informed by the conversations that we've had over the past 2 days and supplemented by the wide-ranging knowledge and expertise that we have assembled here in this panel, what are the biggest opportunities in Calgary that we're not seeing, right? So trying to bring down the conversation to our local context.
Okay, so this means I go first, okay.
Absolutely.
All right, I was like, Mary goes first. Okay, so, we spent a lot of time talking about, we said to call it the west side of the West End, somehow downtown West End, quite thank you. And as I was listening to my good colleagues and many of you talk, it suddenly dawned on me, oh my gosh, people across North America either live in cities that are failing, with downtowns that are failing, or if they're successful cities, their downtowns are too expensive, artists can't live there, families can't live there, teachers can't, all the things that people would love to have downtown, they can't. New immigrants, new Calgarians, whatever, can't live there, etc. All the things that people want can't happen. Well, my gosh, Calgary is talking about creating a new downtown neighborhood. So looking around at the same mistake that every other major city in North America, Canada, and the US have made, it's very simple. Let's create this new neighborhood in a way that allows us to have downtown all the things we can't have. Let's have permanent artists, affordable housing for artists. Let's make sure we have 3-bedroom housing units for families with good schools and lots of daycare, which it turns out, oddly enough, exist in that area. Let's have, we've got lots of vacant space on the ground floor. Let's make that available to people who are bringing their cultures to Calgary. And Todd Zimmerman, one of our colleagues, kept saying, so they can grill their food outside on the street, and then when it's cold, go into that vacant space and give it to them. Let's make this the place that allows Calgary to show the rest of North America how to create a 21st century city that really is inclusive, downtown that really is inclusive, because we have the opportunity. We even figured out how much the subsidy would cost and how to pay for it, but I'm not supposed to talk about that. So it just so happens that Calgary has another problem, and I'm working in a number of cities that share this problem, which is your economy isn't as diverse as you would like it to be, which means you are subject to swings, et cetera. And when I say 90% of net new jobs are going to require education, that means economic growth is going to, long-term sustainable economic growth is going to come from having a strong knowledge innovation economy, okay? Well, it turns out that the same people who would be able to live in this cool new neighborhood, who's maybe don't have great big incomes, are very creative, all those kinds of things going on downtown, are exactly the people that build an innovation economy for a region. When you mentioned East Franklinton and Columbus, Ohio, the core of bringing that neighborhood, it was the poorest neighborhood in Columbus, to life was permanent, long-term, really permanent artist affordable housing that created a really sustainable arts community together with permanent low-cost workspace and gallery space and all the components of the ecosystem. More investment is flowing into East Franklinton. Innovation companies, very expensive housing, all the other things that cities want than anywhere else in Columbus now. Columbus is a successful city. That artist community is still there. It is considered Columbus's creative community, and it will. Well, the West End, whatever, can be that for Calgary in a way that is really well matched to how to create opportunity for everybody in Calgary. And I'm going to finish because I realize everything I'm saying always sounds very elitist, and I don't mean that. So we're doing a lot of work in Buffalo, New York right now. Buffalo is part of the Rust Belt, working in Cleveland, other places. Well, it turns out that when growth comes from a knowledge economy, You can't grow jobs for people without the skills and education to be part of the knowledge economy unless you grow the knowledge economy, because that's how you generate jobs for everyone. So the city of Buffalo, for example, projects that for each knowledge economy job they create 5 other jobs, generally jobs being lost by folks. This is how you, if you don't grow the pie, you can't grow the pieces of the pie, if that makes sense. What we're really talking about is creating opportunity for everybody by creating this cool, wonderful community. So on that note, colleagues.
Yeah, I can't really answer this question, so I'm going to take it in a different direction. I don't know Calgary, I really don't. This is my 4th Canadian city I visited, and don't tell Winnipeg, don't tell Vancouver, don't tell Victoria, but I actually really like this place better. I could see myself raising a family here. It feels comfortable. You've done amazing work on your riverfront. You've got beautiful historic buildings. I've taken a picture of every piece of public art that I've come across, and almost been run over by a few bicyclists because I don't pay enough attention. I'm not used to bicyclists. I live in a city where there's about 8 bicyclists, I think. But I mean, this is a wonderful place. I'm not going to suggest that I know what you could do different or better, but I will say one thing that I learned the hard way over time. One of the smartest people I've ever worked with really taught me this lesson, and I think it applies in most places, that you don't want to spend too much time chasing ghosts. You don't want to spend too much time going after people that don't want to be there, that don't want to be a part of your community. Focus on building the best Calgary, the best place that you can for the people that are already there. Focus on quality of life. Think about what we as a community want, what would make our lives better and easier. And you know what? Outside investment will come. And I want to share a little bit of a downer story. It's a little bit sad, but I think it's relevant. A good friend of mine was the director of our Chamber of Commerce for Memphis in Shelby County. He lived downtown, I lived downtown. We knew each other pretty well. We went to a lot of the same meetings. And he was shot and killed in 2018 right in the middle of one of the most vibrant parts of my neighborhood, the south end of downtown, in a random act of violence. And it was difficult for a few days. We were just beginning to do a master plan with Stantec, and I remember thinking, what is the point of all of this? Yeah, why are we even doing this if something like that could happen? And Phil was his name, and he definitely wouldn't have wanted us to quit. So I spent an afternoon walking around the area where it happened, and I saw this vacant lot. And I thought, what would he want me to do? So we spent some time coming together with neighbors, talked about what would be good there, and we built a dog park. You know, it's a small thing. But the good thing about dog parks, David, you might not know this, but dogs don't usually show up alone to dog parks. They bring people. So, 2-3 months, it's been up for a few years, but 2-3 months into it, I had neighbors, people that didn't know each other, come up to me and say, thank you for doing this. For the first time, I know the people living around me. I know the people in the building next door. And it started to create a great sense of community. And I think that's just an example of great cities, in my humble opinion, they're not made just of mega projects and giant towers. That's important. That can catalyze things. That can be momentum. But great downtowns, great cities are made up of small things that fit together well. People who love a building, love a place, love a business, and invest their time and energy, blood, sweat, and tears into it. That's what make great places. So when I looked at that lot and I thought, what would Phil want me to do? And I followed that same advice. Let's build a great downtown for the people who were here. I wasn't trying to attract dogs from Nashville or Austin or Toronto. I was trying to make a great neighborhood. And I think in a small way, we accomplished that.
And didn't somebody develop some multifamily housing next to it?
Yeah, it did. I don't know if it's just because of the dog park, but I mean, that's the thing about development. No single raindrop is to blame for the flood. And every little thing that you do gets you closer to having the development, the investment, the neighborhood that you want. And you don't know what little piece is going to be the thing that triggers great investment.
In many cities, a majority, particularly of, well, actually both men and women who rent apartments have dogs. Just thought that way.
Guilty, dog owner. I've just got a couple of quick things. One is this notion of assets. We talked about it a bit today in the shred. There's a concept of asset-based community development. For so many years, we looked at places and looked at what they didn't have. And even in child development, we used to do this with kids. Again, I'm old, I remember. You can't do this, you can't do that, instead of what you could do. So we're gradually, evolving an understanding of it. Whether you're raising a child or raising a community, it's the same principle to find what the assets are, exactly what these guys are speaking about. So I have a couple of statements on your assets based on what I saw. I would really encourage you to do not put an over premium on beauty. I can tell you when I moved to New York, Brooklyn was ugly. I'm looking at Robert. Isn't Brooklyn ugly? Brooklyn is still pretty ugly. But Robert's from up there. But Brooklyn is one of the most dynamic, unbelievably creative places. It's unbelievable the kinds of things that are coming out of there. You guys know it's become this like really, really creative place. And there, every city you go to, you will find a neighborhood that really looks kind of downtrodden and ugly and not very beautiful. And in it is all sorts of extraordinary stuff happening. That's true in lots of immigrant neighborhoods, lots of newcomer neighborhoods. We started something at the COI called Bring Back Main Street, because we wanted to talk about local economies and how to strengthen local economies. And one of the things that we said was, there is no same kind of Main Street anywhere, you know. And so for some people, a Main Street may be an old-fashioned set of facades and storefronts, but other places it may be a strip mall, or it may be an auto body shop where people go behind the back where they have an open pit barbecue, and it's the place to be. You guys all know where those places are, right? That's what you want. You want to look at where are those really interesting places where people naturally gravitate to, and do not put a premium on beauty. It does not have to be beautiful. First of all, you live in a beautiful part of the country, so you don't have to create beauty here. You've got it. And so I would say when I look at the West neighborhood, and I could hear people, you know, making judgments, a lot of parking lots, oh, those buildings look kind of crummy, whatever it is. Then, what actually happened to us when we were walking along, we came across a corner and there was a crummy looking building, and this woman came out of it with a guy, and they're having an art studio in there. They have art classes and they were having an art auction. It's the ugliest little place, and there they are doing the most dynamic thing. And it's cheap and it's affordable, and something fantastic is happening there. There are towers of newcomer communities. There are towers in Toronto dominated by refugees and immigrants from other communities that are teeming with small businesses, interesting little arrangements where families are cooking for each other or making clothing or whatever the heck it is. All these things that are so part, and you know, the younger you are, the more you are into this. I always go back to my group that are born after 1975. How many of you, hands up if you thrift? You're like, I didn't even know what thrift was. I'm 63. Like, thrift is a very practical way to deal with the antidote of helplessness on climate. So that's what I would always say, is just remember how ugly Brooklyn is and how thriving it is. And take these as assets that you've got. And I totally agree with David. What we saw in the West End there, and I love the fact you're moving here. That's so nice. Phone your wife and tell her.
I'm scared of the snow. Is that a problem?
No, you hardly notice it.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Brett. Thank you, David. So perhaps aiming to end this panel on a positive note, right? I like balance. We started maybe a bit fatalist, going positive, right? Hand with lots of rings, hand with no rings. So again, aiming to end this panel on a positive note, my last question for you today, and we've already sort of touched upon a few examples. Drawing from the work of your respective organizations and your expertise in the field, what developments, trends, and trajectories are you most excited about? What fire-catching ideas have you encountered in other places that represent exciting new tomorrows? And are there any that would be appropriate for a Calgary context or conducive for deployment in downtown West End?
Redeployment of parking lots. You have so many. Do something fantastic with your parking lots. Really. You will solve so many other cities' problems if you say, look what they're doing with their parking lots in Calgary. It would put you on the map.
Yeah, I haven't caught fire since I was 5 or 6, and we had a candlelight service at church, and I did this, and there's some incredible pictures of me with my hair gone. So I don't think I've ever caught fire since then. But what we have found that works in our market, I mean, your market's different, but you got to be willing to take risks start small, fail fast, and then readjust. And I mean, my background is in architecture too. I love the models, I love the ideas, the energy in the room. But you guys, you should be the leaders. We don't have enough money to do everything the first time perfectly, I don't think. So let's prototype. Let's take your design experience. Let's take your knowledge. Instead of blowing out that curb and spending $1 million, do it with paint. Do it with temporary bollards. Do it with these things we call armadillos that look like dead armadillos in the street. You know, they're plastic. They're not real armadillos. Like, find ways to prototype ideas, show people what's possible. And I like to think that I'm a pragmatist. I work on implementation every day, and there's never enough money to do what we want to do. But I'm a firm believer that the best idea, the right idea, a compelling idea can attract funding and can attract resources.
Oh, and Brett, maybe could you share with the audience about the litigation and how that's a tool that you've used? Because I was fascinated when I heard this.
That's no fun at all. So the way I work, I'm a business improvement district. It's like a BIA. They're a little bit different. But the people that pay my salary, such as it is, they're commercial property owners in the neighborhood. They own the commercial buildings. Some of them are great, some of them are okay, and some of them are absent. And in those cases where the buildings are falling down, we occasionally sue our property owners, which is hard. Has anyone ever sued their boss before? That's not tons of fun, but it's necessary. So under Tennessee state law, you can keep a building vacant, right? This is America, we've got property rights, you don't have to use your building. But as we interpret state law, you have to have a building that can be used. You have to have a building that is in such a condition that it could be inhabited. It's got a roof, it's got working mechanical systems, it's got windows and doors. It has the things that would make it useful. And in those cases where we've got a bad property owner who is unwilling to fix their building, we actually sue them in the local environmental court, which is a civil court, civil proceeding. And the remedy there is that the judge can compel them to sell the property, demolish the property, or renovate the building. And we've done it probably 24 times. Usually it's more of a threat than anything, but we've had a couple of cases that went all the way to the end, and it's been necessary to get things unstuck. So I'm not suggesting you sue property owners. Litigation is never the first club out of the bag, but I think it's an example of how we're scrappy. Memphis has a lot of problems. I mean, we've got some good barbecue, some good music. We have a lot of problems, a lot of challenges, but we view them as opportunities, and we're willing to try things. And this litigation strategy we tried, I think for the first time maybe in 2005, and we adjusted it over the course of the years, and now it's a national model, frankly. So you may not want to do that, but be thinking about what you could do. If you don't have the tool that you need, invent it, create it.
And as somebody has worked with Brett, what I would point out is what he does is bring people to the table who didn't want to come to the table, and then introduce them to a developer or somebody who will actually pay more for their building than they thought it was worth because they have something they want to do with it or know how to turn it into housing or things. It's funny, I had a hard time with fire catching also, and I'm a Unitarian, so we didn't even have candles. So I'm gonna have to find my way to this. First of all, I really agree, I want to agree with Mary now about don't get hung up on beauty. In part, well, I'll tell you, I saw a painting in The Hague, in the Netherlands, in this wonderful museum, that it turned out that in the late 19th century was somehow considered the most admired painting in the world. How, I don't know. Anyway, it was a super realistic painting of a cow with, you could pick out each fly kind of landing on its, anyway, there was nothing beautiful about it to me. But obviously, in a different society, at a different time, in the cultural differences, it was beautiful. I did a fascinating cultural master plan for Detroit, for the Henry Ford Museum. And the really interesting director wanted to do something to bring the very divided Detroit region together, to find a common story, a common heritage. Because as you may know, Detroit is absolutely divided along race. It turned out, in fact, that it's really interesting. There wasn't a common story. The white community said, oh, it's the automobile industry. The black community said, oh, it's the Underground Railroad. I mean, it was really, the divide was so great. But one of the things I learned in the process was that people looked at this incredible heritage of the first Studebaker plant and these incredible automobile showrooms that had been built, et cetera. And they looked at these and they thought they're ugly, and they were ugly because they were the evidence of failure, of the failed automobile industry. So, okay, 10 years later, they love them because now they're the new cool, if this makes sense. You know, we look at all these beautiful glass buildings, and a lot of people really like them. I think they like them because, how do I say it? They just smell of success, of rich people who can live beautiful lives, etc. So they're beautiful. So beauty is very fleeting. What is not fleeting is quality of life and individual opportunity and what makes people's lives better. Several people have asked us as if we have the answer. He's great about not having the answer, like some of us think we're supposed to. About how do we make Calgary adaptable? What should we be doing now to be relevant and competitive in 10 years? And none of us knows, except that we know if Calgary and the new West Side or West End or West Downtown are places where all kinds of people really want to live because they see their lifestyles represented and enabled, then Calgary will be pretty adaptable because these are the bright, creative, cool people who will be the vanguards for each new economic cycle that we go through. Is this making sense? It really does start with people. So now I'm going to get to my answer. What most excites me, so I mentioned that 70% of us earn less in real dollar terms than we did in 1970. 30% of us, particularly the top 10%, are going to have great lives. You know, our incomes are going to continue to rise faster. We're going to have more and more opportunity. We're going to live in these fantastic glass buildings that cost $1 million, et cetera, because we are set up to succeed in the economy in which we live, if that makes sense. And aside from the other 70% need a lot of help. And it is those things that help these folks that I get really excited about. So when we were working in New Orleans, this was after I first met Mary. I was working on a second project, take down something called the Claiborne Expressway. Claiborne Expressway had been built to protect downtown from the largely black neighborhoods, African American neighborhoods, just to the, I think it's to the west of downtown. Downtown, I think, is Lakeside or Riverside, as opposed to north or south. So, now a bunch of folks wanted to take it down, very progressive, et cetera. An organization I love, the Congress and Urbanism, showed up and helped us. And they showed how beautiful it could be if you took down the expressway and planted about 2 million trees and wonderful allays, et cetera. And the real issue was that the folks who lived in these largely African-American poor neighborhoods knew that if that Claiborne came down, they'd be out of there. What protected their ability to live in these neighborhoods was that they weren't that great to live in. So other people didn't want to live there and displaced them, which is why all those beautiful trees weren't that effective. So what we had to do was say, okay, well, what would make your life better if we took this down? Well, lo and behold, enough affordable housing dollars so that we know we can stay here in one fashion or another. Tax relief that says if we're 65 and I have a certain under a certain income, housing under a certain level, that our real estate taxes will be frozen, so we won't be pushed out by other, et cetera. Downtown, was beginning to come back. A lot of folks were starting to move to New Orleans because it was just so much fun. They were building a knowledge industry. These folks had no access to it. So they wanted to know, what would it take to give us access to the benefits of being part of downtown? And it turns out, after some research, I didn't know this at the time, that most of these folks, actually, it's funny, 80% of them have jobs. 20% is pretty high unemployment, but 80% of them have jobs. Their average income left them in poverty, so they were in working poverty, et cetera. So it showed jobs weren't the answer. That's because there were many more of them than there were jobs that needed their skill level. With 2 more years of education or skills training, that entirely reversed. Suddenly, there were more jobs than there were them. 2 years. 2 years is not that difficult, not that expensive. You can find ways to provide childcare, et cetera, to give people access to that. Does this make sense? So the Claiborne, the initiative to take down the expressway turned into the was it Claiborne Community Initiative. I forgot the exact name. I'm terrible. My memory is terrible. But it was all about creating economic opportunity, making neighborhoods sustainable, protecting culture. How do I say this? What many folks in Black New Orleans really celebrated was their West African heritage. What they shared was around music. It was around, you know, the crews and things where you'll hear about the funerals with music were directly 21st century sort of enactments of a culture that had been passed down. This was, well, a lot of it involved making a lot of noise. And what those people who moved into some of these neighborhoods said, they're making too much noise at night. They're making all this, playing all these loud musical instruments, etc. Well, this was culture. So, long story short, what they wanted to know were all the things that made their lives work, could make their lives better, could make them benefit from being part of downtown, would be part of this plan. And it turned out that New Orleans really stepped forward, I think, on this, you know. So what to me is really fire-catching are those ideas that can make equity and inclusivity actually real. And we're much better at the rhetoric. Yeah, I'm going to say something very. I have a son who's involved in human rights, so he's actually getting, he's mostly working globally, but he's actually beginning to get involved in reparations issues in the U.S. And you know, it turns out that there are a lot of people who are just not in a position to join the middle class for all kinds of reasons, and that's because of their parents' lives and their grandparents' lives, et cetera, you know, and they need help that goes beyond recognition, if that makes sense. I love the way you open every meeting, and I'm very serious, with recognition of the ancestral lands, et cetera. But you know, it probably takes more of that to really equalize the playing field. I'm sorry, to finish. One more New Orleans story. The Planning Commission in New Orleans was very divided between Black liberals and white conservatives. And we, my colleagues and I said, as part of this master plan, you know, we have to have an equity component. And the Black liberals said, that's great. The white conservatives, who had applied before a majority, said, that's communism. Literally, that's communism. And we ended up having a series of incredible lunch meetings with different people to help them understand what equity meant. And I still remember there was one from Marshall Truehill. Did you know Marshall Truehill before?
Rest in peace.
One of the heroes of my life. He's African American, but really trying to bridge the racial divide. Finally got through to the most vociferous of the white commissioners by saying, you know I don't want you to work hard and give your money to me. That's not what equity is. Equity is giving me an even playing field with you. And that made a difference. So those places, those ideas that can even the playing field for all of us, give all these kids the opportunities that we want for them, is what I think is really exciting.
So why don't we give a round of applause to our panelists. Mary, Brent, David, thank you for your very enlightening answers. I know some of my questions might be some curveballs, but hopefully begin to elucidate on some of the questions that we all have, that we're trying to sort of solve both in our work, in our schools, and now in our communities. So before we move on to the last portion of today's event, I also want to again thank Stantec, and in particular Marcus Patterson, who's been a huge sort of agent in making sure all this was possible. So I want to thank Marcus Patterson from Stantec.
She's the one who really advocated for all of us to do this.
And Nancy McDonald, who's sitting right next to Marcus Patterson. Who, in the words of David, really advocated for all of us to be able to be here today. So again, Marcus, Nancy, thank you for inviting us to be part of this. All of the all the sort of conversations, discussions from the last 2 days, from this evening, and from tomorrow, when the design shark will conclude, will be sort of compiled together in a report that Stantec and SAP will be sort of co-releasing and hopefully begin to generate further conversations. So in the spirit of those conversations and discussions, we want to invite you to a second reception. So we have some more food now, and then drinks again. And hopefully, we have a really interesting makeup of attendees here. We have developers, people who work for the city, industry professionals, various students. So we hope that this becomes an evening opportunity to sort of mingle, interact, and continue some of the conversations and questions that we're having around how do we best address the challenges that we're facing today. So again, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I invite you to join us for additional things and food. Thank you.